Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. After 3 semesters of engineering coursework that left my brain feeling like mush, I was 21 years old and totally lost 2 years ago. I was living in my beat-up Civic and using my phone to browse job advertisements outside of a Fargo McDonald's. I saw the advertisement for Harrison Farms seasonal work housing while using their Wi-Fi. It didn't require any experience, and the compensation wasn't spectacular, but it was free, so I could finally stop sleeping in my car. I contacted the number, and 2 days later I was traveling on a dirt road. Carl Harrison, my new boss, met me at the main building. He was a weathered man in his 60s with sun-damaged skin and pale blue eyes that never seemed to go away. The farm stretched endlessly in every direction, nothing but flat fields of sugar beets under the vast North Dakota sky. Blink brought me to the worker quarters, a repurposed shipping container with bunk beds and a small bathroom. 3 other men, Eduardo from Guatemala, Dimitri from Ukraine, and Tommy, a local boy my age, resided there as well. But they all kept to themselves and hardly acknowledged me. My duty was to simply operate the tractor, plow the appropriate fields, and harvest when it was ripe. When I went through the atmosphere, I felt weighted, as if everyone was holding their breath waiting for something horrible to happen. Carl handed me he pointed to a red outlined region close to the property's eastern side, which is off limits. The old irrigation system underground is very costly to repair, so if you damage it, you plow any place but there. I was given a laminated map on my first day that had different sections designated in different colors. His finger stayed on the red zone for longer than required, and his voice made it obvious that this was about more than just irrigation. I nodded, folded the map, and assumed it would be simple enough to avoid a single little area in hundreds of acres. The days blended together, and I woke up at the crack of dawn to have coffee. Eduardo would occasionally mutter prayers in Spanish, while working Dimitri chain smoked during breaks, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He had gone from a pot that tasted like motor oil to hours on the tractor under the endless sky, and the other workers had continued to avoid conversation beyond simple pleasantries. There was a weight to the place, a thickness in the air that made you want to finish your work and go to your bunk. But the money was solid, and after 2 weeks I began to understand their conduct. Tani simply worked in silence, his earplugs always fully tuned out. Everything changed on a Thursday morning in late September. The sunrise painted the fields pink and orange, and a light fog hung over the beets like a blanket. I was working the eastern section cautiously, sticking to my usual route, and I thought I could handle a few months of strange vibes. I tried recalibrating the tractor when the GPS started to malfunction, but it kept jumping around, putting me in different places every few seconds. Without the GPS, I had to rely on visual cues. The screen flashed, showing me approximately 50 yards off from where I actually was. Landmarks, but in those endless fields, one row of beets looks exactly like another. I took out the laminated map and tried to get my bearings by comparing what I could see through the morning haze with the faded markers. This is when I made the mistake of believing that I was safely inside the restricted area to the west. However, the fog and the same rows had twisted me around, and the plough struck a solid object with a metallic screech that made my teeth hurt. I immediately killed the engine, my heart pounding, and descended to inspect the damage. The plough had struck the edge of something buried roughly 3 feet below the surface, and it was unquestionably an irrigation pipe. I thought I had discovered some ancient farm equipment buried and forgotten when I noticed rusted metal through the churned earth, possibly the corner of a vehicle. However, as I knelt down and brushed away more dirt with my gloved hands, I realized I was looking at the tailgate of a pickup truck, and the Ford logo was still visible. The truck had been light blue under layers of dirt and rust, but now it was primarily the color of the ground that had engulfed it. I should have stopped digging, gotten back on the tractor, and told Carl about it, but curiosity is a strong thing. And I continued to remove dirt, exposing more of the truck bed. At that point, I noticed that the North Dakota license plate tags were still partially readable despite the years underground. Surprisingly, my phone had signal out there, so I took a picture before searching for North Dakota license plate lookup online, and the results made the plate belonged to a 1997 Ford F-150 registered to Miguel Vega, who was reported missing 6 years ago along with its owner. The news item about the migrant worker disappearing from Harrison Farms was still up online. Miguel had been 28 years old when the incident occurred. Carl Harrison was quoted in the article as saying that Miguel had appeared homesick and had likely decided to return to Mexico, but his truck was buried here. Miguel had a wife and 2 children back in Chihuahua, and he had been working the sugar beet harvest just like me when he allegedly left in the middle of the night without receiving his last paycheck. The window was down about halfway in the field's forbiddance area, and even though years of dirt had filtered in, I could see inside when I walked around to the driver's side, my boots sinking into the soft, disturbed earth. That's when I noticed the smell, not strong, but distinct like old leather, combined with I used a flashlight on my phone to look through the opening and saw something lovely and strange. The beam of light illuminated the steering wheel and the heavily dust-covered dashboard, and then the shape in the driver's seat briefly caught my attention. Clothes had mostly rotted away, but denim never goes bad, and I could see remnants of pants. The seat belt was still secured where the head should have been, and the only thing visible was a skull leaning back against the headrest with his mouth open as if he had been the skeletal hand that was still gripping the steering wheel, was screaming, and the other hand was resting on what was left of his lap fingers, curled around something metallic. I fought the urge to throw up and leaned closer, stumbling backward and tripping over a small silver cross on a chain that looked like it was meant to be worn around your neck. When a clump of dirt fell hard on my ass, my entire body tingled with fear. This wasn't simply a missing person. Someone had murdered Miguel by burying him in his own truck on Harrison property. I hurried to my feet and fled. As I climbed into the cab, I noticed movement in the distance. Carl's white pickup was heading my way, kicking up a cloud of dust. He must have seen me stop out here, because my stomach turned as I watched him approach. And then Eduardo's prayers and Dimitri's anxious. Carl drew up near the tractor and got out slowly, his movements methodical and quiet, and he strolled over to where I'd been digging. He stood there for a long time staring, and smoking made perfect sense. They might not have known the specifics, but they knew this property carried terrible secrets. I stepped down on trembling legs as he looked down at the exposed truck and turned to face me. His face was utterly blank, and his pale blue eyes were as icy as the North Dakota winter. "Come on down here, son," he murmured in a calm, quiet voice. Carl lit a cigarette, took a long suck, and exhaled slowly while maintaining a neutral expression, as though I hadn't just discovered a corpse. "You know what you found?" he questioned, and I nodded, not believing my own voice. After what seemed like hours of studying me, he said that Miguel was stealing from me by seizing equipment and skimming wages from the other workers. When I confronted him, he grabbed a knife and hesitated, flicking ash onto the disturbed ground in self-defense. The deception was so well practiced and seamless that Carl moved closer till I could smell the tobacco on his breath, and I realized that he had already said it, possibly to himself or to someone who had questioned him too much, and that disputing would be dangerous and fruitless. "Now you got to choices you can forget," Carl said. He didn't finish the sentence, but his hand moved to his hip, pushing back his jacket just enough to reveal the pistol tucked into his waistband. "What you saw here. Finish out the season. Take a nice bonus when you leave and never come back," he continued. "What about workers who disappear? Is that nobody truly searches for them, particularly dropouts who have no family members to check in with?" I croaked out, but my throat felt like sandpaper. "I'll finish the season, Carl. Smart boy. You're going to help me cover this up again. And then you're going to return to work as if nothing had happened. If I understand correctly, you've been talking to the other workers, anyone in town, or anybody at all. Well, there's plenty of room in these fields. After we finished, Carl gave me a rag to wipe my face and said, "GPS should be working fine now." We then spent the next hour piling dirt back over Miguel's truck to hide the evidence of a life stolen. It's funny how these things can fix. That night, I lay in my bunk staring at the ceiling with the picture of Miguel's license plate burning a hole in my phone. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, and I kept thinking about his family, wondering what had happened to him. He drove away, leaving me standing there in the field, knowing I was trapped. The next 3 weeks were agony. I went through the routine of waking up, working, eating, and sleeping, but on the inside, I was disintegrating. Carl watched me all the time, sometimes even while I was just sitting in his truck at the edge of the field I was working in. The other employees also noticed the change, and Eduardo began leaving little food offerings outside my bunk, as if he were feeding a one-night. "Tommy," the sentence man said to me in a muttered, gloomy voice. "He's done it before." That's when I realized I had to get out, bonus or no bonus, so I started making plans carefully not to alter my routine because I'd been wise enough. I told Carl that I needed to drive to town for supplies, toothpaste, deodorant, and other necessities, knowing that he might check on a Sunday morning in mid-October. He looked at me for a long time before throwing me the keys to one of the farm trucks and returning. I decided to send the photo to myself and remove it from my phone. When he responded, "Or I'll come looking," at midday, I drove directly to the police station, my hands holding the wheel until they went numb. Patricia Brennan, the detective who took my statement, had good eyes and listened without interjecting when I showed her the picture and informed her of everything, so she called the FBI. Apparently, crimes involving migrant workers were under federal jurisdiction, and within hours, the location was packed with agents. They located Miguel's truck precisely where I had predicted it would be. Along with 2 other Carl was arrested at a truck stop near the Canadian border while attempting to flee with a bag full of cash. The other employees were moved and granted temporary protective status as witnesses, and I testified via video link from an undisclosed location. 3 families finally received answers after their vehicles were buried in various parts of the farm. At least his family could finally bury him properly. And that cross he'd been holding his back with his widow, despite the death threats Carl's nephews had been making. The last I heard, Carl was given life without parole. I still have nightmares about that morning in the field, when Miguel's skull tilted back in eternal silence. The grant money wasn't much, but for a graduate student researching crop rotation, patterns and soil composition in rural Georgia, it was sufficient. I discovered the Farmhouse listing on a university board. Sometimes doing the right thing means risking everything, and other times it's the only option that allows you to sleep at night. The rent was suspiciously low, even for remote Georgia, but I assumed the owner just wanted someone to watch over the property. Mrs. Whitfield, the landlord, told me over the phone that her previous tenant was a man named Garrett. The property was 40 acres of land with a 2-bedroom house that hadn't been updated since the 1970s, had lived there for almost 20 years before relocating to a trailer park 20 minutes away. She said he might come by sometimes to pick up some tools he left in the barn, and I shouldn't mind him because agricultural research can be a very solitary job. I spent my first 2 months collecting soil samples, cataloguing the existing plant life, and planning where I would set up my test plots because the property was perfect for my research, untouched farmland with a variety of soil conditions and old irrigation infrastructure that I could study and map. The house itself was livable enough, but I threw myself into the work, thankful for the solitude after years of claustrophobic dorm living and shared apartments. It smelled like decades of cigarette smoke and had that strange mustiness that comes from a place being closed up too long. The closest neighbour was 3 miles away, and cell service was the land had a network of pipes and channels that hadn't been used in years, all clogged with roots and sediment. So I started working on the ancient irrigation system in early March. It was spotty at best, just me, my study, and the occasional coyote howling in the distance at night. I started the laborious task of mapping and clearing the lines about 200 yards from the house, close to what was once a peach orchard, in order to understand the water table and drainage patterns for my research. I discovered a section where the pipes appeared to converge. The area was covered in brambles and kudzu, and as I hacked after removing years of plant growth and accumulated dirt, I discovered what appeared to be ancient sheets of plywood that had weathered and partially decayed, covering something underneath. The wood, which came away when my shovel struck something solid through the vegetation, not stone or pipe, but wood. Fragments exposing a circular stone rim beneath it. Based on the uneven stonework, the well was likely hand-dug. The opening was roughly 4 feet across and lined with field stones that vanished into the darkness below. I took my flashlight from the truck and pointed it down the shaft. The beam barely, when I got to the bottom, maybe 20 feet down. I could see what appeared to be dried leaves and debris, but there was also something else there, partially buried. In the accumulated debris, partially wrapped in what looked like chicken wire. The shape was off somehow, too intentional to be just farm waste. As my eyes adjusted, the sensible portion of my brain quickly kicked in when I realized I was staring at human bones, clearly organized in the fetal position and securely wrapped in rusted wire. As the flashlight beam steadied, this may be old, extremely old, but the chicken wire bothered me, because that type of galvanized wire mesh wasn't something you'd find in a historical burial. Georgia has a long history, and rural properties like this frequently have forgotten graves or family plots. I got back in my truck and drove to the house, my mind racing with what I should do. Call the police, of course. When I returned to the well, I fastened the rope to a nearby tree and lowered myself just far enough to capture clearer photographs, since I needed better pictures first, some sort of documentation. I retrieved my nice camera, a measuring tape, and a longer rope from the barn. The smell hit me about halfway down, not through the camera lens. The details became horrifyingly clear. The skeleton was small, possibly a teenager or small adult, and the wire wasn't just wrapped around it, it was methodically wound. The ancient mustiness you'd expect from old bones was one thing that made my throat tighten, but another was the smell of decay that hadn't quite finished its job. I took picture after picture, my finger moving automatically as my mind attempted to process what I was seeing. Layer after layer, as if someone had taken their time. There were pieces of fabric caught in the wire that had faded but not broken, and what appeared to be the remains of duct tape around where the skull's mouth would be. Whatever had happened here couldn't have been more than a few years ago. I pulled myself out of that well faster than I'd gone down, scraping my palms raw on the stone edges in my haste. It was either a forgotten cemetery plot or a burial from the Civil War. The bones were to clean and white, arrived 3 hours after I called. Two deputies arrived first, followed by young men who appeared to prefer to be somewhere else. They used flashlights to look down the well, made some calls, and instructed me to wait by the house. By evening, the property was packed with state police forensic teams, and even a few I gave my statement 6 times to 6 different people, each asking the same questions with slight variations. When did I find it? Had I touched anything? Did anyone else know about the well? FBI agents who refused to explain their purpose set up a tent over the well and brought in specialized equipment to remove the remains. The lead detective Hensley, who appeared to have seen to many crime scenes, finally informed me what they had discovered. The remains belonged to a person who had been on the property recently. The forensic team worked through the night with generator-powered lights, transforming the old peach orchard into a harsh, shadowless crime scene. I didn't want to know that the chicken wire had been wrapped around the young woman, who was likely in her late teens or early 20s, who had been reported missing from Valdoa 5 years prior, had been alive when she entered the well, as evidenced by the location of the bones and other information. Detective Hensley asked me again about the history of the property and anyone who might have had access to this area while she was still breathing, and the duct tape remnants supported what the positioning suggested. That's when I recalled what Mrs. Whitfield had said about Garrett, the former tenant who still stopped by to see how things were going. She said that for the last 20 years, he had been the only person with regular access to the property. The cops asked me to describe Garrett, but I had never met him. Mrs. Whitfield had made him seem like a pleasant elderly man who couldn't quite let go of the land. After exchanging glances, when I brought this up, Hensley asked if I had Mrs. Whitfield's contact details. Within an hour, they had retrieved Garrett's data. He is 63 years old, lives in the dilapidated Pine Grove Trailer Park, and has no criminal history, just a couple. The timing was damning. He had been the only occupant of this property from 2001 to 2023 and had performed a variety of farm labor jobs over the years. Nothing steady, nothing that would identify him as anything other than a rural Georgia vagrant. He had a history of old doings from the 1990s. While the forensic team was still examining the scene, Garrett arrived 2 days after the girl in the well vanished in 2019. I was sitting on the porch, trying to concentrate on my laptop, but mostly just watching at the activities near the well when an elderly man, the man who got out of the Ford Ranger as it pulled up the drive, was shorter than I had anticipated, maybe 5'6", wearing overalls and a John Deere cap that had seen better days. He had the leathery skin of someone who had lived in the Georgia sun for decades, and his pale blue eyes seemed to take in everything at once. He approached the porch as if he owned it, which, after 20 years, I suppose he felt he did. "You the college boy renting from Mrs. Whitfield?" I nodded, unsure of what to say, as he asked in a slow, country voice that might be interpreted as either kind or dangerous. His gaze strayed to the chaos beside the ancient orchard, and for a little moment, his look changed, not in a startling way, but perhaps resignation found its way to me, didn't it? He murmured, and before I could react, Detective Hensley was approaching us with her hand resting on her service weapon. Garrett saw her coming and did something I will never forget. He smiled. It wasn't a nervous or perplexed smile, but rather the contented smile of someone who had been waiting for this moment. When he said, "I was wondering when someone would finally look under that wood," he held out his wrists as if he expected to be cuffed right there. It had been driving me crazy to know that she was down there calling out to everyone who passed by. The detective had her cuffs out, but she paused at his words, calling out, "Oh yes, Mum, every night for 5 years, I've been scratching at the stones, whispering up through the earth." "Why do you think I moved to that trailer?" she questioned, and Garrett nodded, his eyes now far away. He was taken away in the back of a patrol car because he could no longer stand the noise, and I watched from the porch as he gazed out the window at me without showing any emotion, as if he were listening to something that only he could hear. The investigation turned up to more bodies in nearby wells. Garrett confessed to all 3 murders without being asked, detailing in detail how he had selected women who were passing through and wouldn't be missed right away, keeping them alive in the wells 4 days while dropping down from abandoned properties. Both young women had gone missing in the early 2000s. I couldn't finish my research grant because every time I tried to work on the property, I would find myself staring at that section of the orchard and remembering the smell from the water and food while listening to them plead and scream until their voices gave out. The prosecutor said it was one of the worst cases they'd seen in Georgia. Garrett's nonchalant admission that I violated my lease after 3 weeks and drove back to Atlanta in a single day, leaving the majority of my equipment behind, made the institution realize how they couldn't understand why I occasionally lie or think about Garrett's statement that she had been calling out for 5 years, while living in an apartment surrounded by street lights and city noise. I know it's impossible because the dead don't talk, but I also know that I won't be going near another well for the rest of my life. When I saw a job posting for a temporary caretaking position on a rural farm out the side of Lancaster, I jumped at the chance because the pay was good and it included housing in a small guest cottage on the property. I had moved to Pennsylvania in early 2021 after losing my job as a nurse during the pandemic. Be caring for Walter Hoffman, an 82-year-old man who owned a 200-acre farm that had been in his family for 3 generations. Walter needed assistance with light housework, medication administration, and everyday duties as he recovered from hip replacement surgery. Cooking his meals, helping him get around, and making sure he took his medications on time seemed like a simple enough task. But what I didn't anticipate was how remote the location would feel, particularly on those long winter evenings, when the wind would howl through the naked trees surrounding the property. Walter was a strange elderly man with thick wire-rimmed glasses that made his pale blue eyes appear much larger than they actually were. He had a tendency to stare at you for a few beats too long before answering questions, as if he was thinking about what you had said in greater detail. His voice was quiet and raspy, almost like a whisper, which the farmhouse itself was a labyrinth of creaking floorboards and poorly lighted halls packed with faded family photos from the early 1900s, which gave the impression that conversations were strangely private even while we were talking about everyday topics like grocery lists or his physical therapy exercises. Walter spent most of his days watching old westerns on a small television with the volume turned up uncomfortably loud. He would frequently mutter to himself during the shows, occasionally laughing at unfunny jokes or making observations. Walter rarely left his recliner in the living room other than for meals and bathroom breaks. The property included a number of facilities strewn over the acreage, including a massive red barn that hadn't held livestock in decades, a smaller equipment shed, and what Walter called his workshop, though he never described the type of work he'd done there. When I asked him what he was looking at, he would simply shake his head and change the topic. The barn itself was probably 100 years old, with weathered wood siding and a metal roof that had rust spots. During my first few weeks, I would occasionally catch him staring out the kitchen window toward the barn area with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was in the second week of February when I first noticed the bleeding down, which looked like old stains. I would pass it on my evening walks around the property, trying to see through the gaps in the boards, but the interior was too dark to see much beyond some old farm equipment and stacks of what appeared to be building materials covered in tarps. I was taking Walter's old collie, Buster, for his afternoon walk on the concrete slabs when the dog suddenly ran toward the back of the barn and began barking at something I couldn't see because the ground had become muddy and uneven from the recent snow melt. As I followed Buster around the corner, I noticed these rectangular forms that were partially exposed in the soft dirt initially appeared to be ruins of a building that had been demolished or perhaps old foundation stones, but something about their consistent size and spacing struck me as strange. I could count at least 6 of them. The concrete was ancient and aged, with moss and lichen growing in the cracks, but you could still see the flawless polish that suggested they had been carefully poured. They were organized into tidy rows, each about the size of a big dining room table. Buster continued to pour at one of the slabs and whining in a way I had never heard him do before, as if he were trying to convey something significant. That night, when I brought Walter his evening medication, I mentioned in passing the concrete slabs behind the barn, and his attitude instantly and clearly changed. His face went completely white, and he sat for a long time. He just stared at me through the thick glasses, his hands shaking, and I could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. Then he cleared his throat and said in a soft, whispered voice, that those were simply remnants of an old septic system from when the property had several buildings, which he claimed his father had torn down other buildings in the 1960s, and that what I had seen was only residual foundation work. But there was a false casualness in his tone that contrasted with the apparent distress on his face. He continued to fidget with the hem of his cardigan and avoided eye contact. He resisted my offer to help him go to bed later, something he had never done before, and I could hear him moving about his room after midnight. The following morning, Walter was waiting for me in the kitchen when I arrived from the cottage to make his breakfast. He was sitting stiffly at the kitchen table with his hands folded in front of him, and he dressed himself, which was unusual, because he usually needed assistance with buttons and shoelaces. He told me that he had been thinking about our conversation from the previous evening, and that he wanted to show me something. His voice had the same strained quality, but there was also he led me slowly through the house to a small room I had never seen before, which he used as a makeshift office. The walls were covered with yellowed newspaper clippings, old photos, and what appeared to be business documents dating back several years. It was almost as if he was relieved to finally talk about whatever was bothering him. When he opened the big manila folder tied with string that had been on his desk for decades, I saw licenses, certificates, and official-looking documents with letterheads that I didn't know. Walter sat down profoundly in his desk chair and started to explain that prior to becoming a full-time farmer, he'd ran what he called a family mortuary service out of the barn. He said that it wasn't technically legal because he had never obtained the necessary licenses or permissions, but he had been burying people in the 1970s and early 1980s who couldn't afford traditional funeral homes. He told me that his uncle, who had experience in the funeral business, had taught him embalming techniques, and that he had assisted local families in getting their departed loved ones ready for burial. He showed me some of the documentation, which included handwritten receipts and thank you notes from families expressing gratitude for his services. But as he spoke, it seemed like he had practiced this explanation a lot. His timeline had gaps, and he would get evasive and shift the topic when I asked specific questions about the licensing or health department oversight. I couldn't stop thinking about those concrete slabs and Walter's explanation for the next few days. I couldn't quite put my finger on why, but I started to pay more attention to Walter's behavior and saw that he had started to watch me more intently, especially every time I took Buster for a walk outside near the barn area. He would set up shop by the kitchen window, and I would see him following me around with his enlarged eyes. He also began asking me specific questions about my background, including where I had previously worked and whether I had family in the area. He became noticeably upset when I told him that I had video chatted with my sister in California and shown her the farmhouse, and he asked me not to share any more information about the property with outsiders. He claimed to value his privacy and didn't want people to become interested in the old house. On a wet Wednesday morning in late February, while I was assisting Walter with his physical therapy exercises, his phone rang. It was an old landline that hardly ever got calls, but I could hear a man's voice on the other end speaking in urgent, clipped tones. Walter's answers were primarily yes. This was the tipping point. And no, but when I asked him if everything was okay, he hung up and sat in his chair for over an hour without saying anything, just staring at the TV screen. Even though it wasn't turned on, I overheard him remark something about being quiet, and that too much time had passed. For the first time since I started working there, he yelled at me, telling me to keep my mouth shut and concentrate on my work. Later that afternoon, I saw a dark blue sedan parked at the end of the long driveway. It was far enough away that I couldn't see the license plate, but it was close enough to give me anxiety. Therefore, roughly 3 hours before vanishing, and when I told Walter about it, he said he hadn't seen anything. That night, I made a decision that would alter everything because I couldn't get rid of the suspicion that those concrete slabs weren't just the remains of an old septic system. And Walter's paranoia was growing. Behavior was seriously endangering my safety. so I used my laptop to look up the property records online. What I saw made my stomach turn. The farm had been the focus of several police investigations into missing persons cases over the years, where people had last been observed in the neighborhood, including reports of strange behavior from neighbors, at least to formal investigations that had been terminated without a conclusion, and a 1983 news article regarding a state health department inquiry into illegal mortuary operations in rural Pennsylvania. Even though there was no particular mention of Walter's name, the description of the area precisely matched his property. I spent hours going through all I could discover, and by morning I had decided to notify the police. I called the Pennsylvania State Police from my Sergeant Williams, the trooper I spoke with that morning while Walter was still asleep. Listened patiently as I explained the situation and what I had discovered behind the barn. He stated that they had been keeping an eye on the property for years because of various tips and reports, but they had never had enough evidence to support a search warrant. But my first-hand description of the concrete slabs and the history of the property was sufficient to proceed with an inquiry. He instructed me to act normally around Walter and assured me that investigators would visit the property within 24 hours. That day was torturous. I had to cook for Walter, assist him with his exercises, and engage in small talk while knowing that everything was going to fall apart. Nevertheless, he seemed to sense a change because he kept asking me how I was feeling and remarked on how I appeared distracted and distant. Walter, wearing a bathrobe, answered the door when the police arrived the following morning with a search warrant and a team of forensic experts. His expression of resigned defeat told me everything I needed to know. Instead of objecting or questioning them, he simply nodded slowly and moved aside to allow them entry. I watched from the cottage window as they cordoned off the area. The forensics team cleared the area behind the barn and started the meticulous process of excavating around the concrete slabs. What they discovered over the course of the following 3 days would make headlines throughout the state. Each slab covered a shallow grave that contained human remains, some of which were from the 1970s, as Walter had claimed, but others that were much more recent. 11 people, ranging in age from teenagers to elderly adults, had their remains recovered. Some displayed traumatizing signs that suggested violent deaths, while others seemed to have died naturally. The investigation found that Walter had, in fact, run an unlicensed mortuary service, but Walter was arrested and charged with several counts of improperly disposing of human remains, running an unregistered mortuary, and conspiracy to commit murder. During his interrogation, he admitted to disposing of bodies for local criminals who needed to make victims disappear forever. He stated that he had merely assisted with funeral arrangements and had never been actively involved in any murders, but the evidence indicated that he had assisted in the disposal of remains for a criminal organization that had operated throughout Pennsylvania and portions of New Jersey in the 1970s and 1980s. The phone call I overheard that Wednesday morning seemed to be from someone alerting Walter that former colleagues were being questioned by federal investigators. Some victims had been reported missing over the years, while others had never been reported at all. These individuals were probably those who had slipped through society's cracks and would not be missed. Working on cold cases, which is why he had become so controlling and paranoid in his last days. He knew that everything would eventually come to light. 8 months later, I testified at Walter's trial, explaining what I had seen while I was taking care of him and how I had found the concrete. Walter, who is now confined to a wheelchair and appears much older than his 82 years, shown little emotion during the hearings and was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. The courtroom was filled with relatives of the victims, some of whom had been yearning for answers for more than 40 years. Prison with no chance of release, even though his advanced age and deteriorating health meant he would probably pass away there in a few years. The state took possession of the farm, which was later sold at auction, with the money raised going to a victim compensation fund I frequently wonder what happened to Buster the Old. It's difficult to be a single mother, especially when you're late on rent and have a 6-year-old daughter. The investigating officers told me that the co-worker who had initially led me to those concrete slabs had been sent to a local animal shelter, but I never followed up to find out if he had found a new home or found employment, constantly asking, "Why you cry in the restroom?" I had been looking for a job for 3 months when I came across an ad on Craigslist for a live-in farm management position in rural Oklahoma that paid well. The person who submitted the ad was Benjamin Hayes, and when we spoke on the phone, his voice had a kind, grandfatherly tone that instantly made me feel comfortable. He described his 400-acre farm and how he wanted a trustworthy person to assist with daily operations because his arthritis was growing worse. It's the trip to Hayes Farm took us past tiny towns with populations less than my previous apartment block and over endless wheat fields. He added, "It's peaceful out here, perfect place for a little one to grow up." I packed our things that same week, and my daughter Emma had her face plastered against the window. The farmhouse looked exactly like something from a postcard, with whitewood siding, a wraparound porch, and a red barn in the distance. As we finally turned down the long gravel driveway, I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in months. I'd been pointing at every cow and horse we passed the entire time. A tall man in his 70s with silver hair and gentle blue eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles appeared from the front door as we pulled up. He was wearing a clean work boot and a pressed flannel shirt, and when he smiled, deep wrinkles formed around his eyes. "Welcome home," he said, and Emma had acres to safely explore, and Benjamin treated her like the granddaughter he never had, teaching her to gather eggs from the chickens and letting her name all the barn cats. I almost thought it was real for the first few weeks, and I didn't want to wake up. My duties were simple, feeding the animals. Benjamin had stated that he was a retired pastor, and it was evident in everything he did. He mentioned grace before every meal, kept his house spotless, and talked about his late wife Margaret with the kind of reverence typically reserved for sons. Emma and I lived in a clean, comfortable guest cottage with fresh flowers in mason jars and lavender-scented quilts. For the first time since her father's departure, I thought we might be all right, but about the 4th week I began to notice the smell. The old water tank, which was located about 50 yards behind the main house, had a rusted metal cylinder that Benjamin told me had not been used in decades and that he had been meaning to have removed. At first, it was just a faint smell of something disagreeable when the wind blew from the east side of the property. His hand dismissed it, but as is typically the case with ancient houses, there are always other things that need to be fixed. To start, the fragrance grew stronger as summer went on, especially on hot afternoons, and it made me think of the day a raccoon died beneath our previous apartment building. It was sweet and sickly. When we passed that location, Emma began to hold her breath and make exaggerated gagging looks that would have been humorous in other situations. By August, the stink had become so bad that I had to take longer routes around simply to stay away from that section of the land, but the stench seemed to follow me everywhere, sticking to my hair and clothes and giving me nightmares about rotting things buried in dark corners. When I brought it up to Benjamin again, his normally friendly manner changed a little, and his smile tightened more. "Could be a septic issue," he suggested, avoiding eye contact. However, there was no septic system anywhere close to that tank, and it's possible that an animal crawled under there to die. These old farms, have their way of taking care of things. However, I'd grown up in the country before moving to the city, and I was aware of the stench of dead animals, but this was different and worse. One evening, while Emma was inside watching cartoons, I chose to explore the property alone, and as I got closer to the water tank, I breathed through my mouth to prevent the worst. I walked around the whole perimeter of the tank, noting how certain places appeared to have been disturbed more recently than others. The ground around the base of the tank was uneven, with patches of yellowed grass and areas where the dirt looked darker and more compacted than the surrounding earth. Tire tracks that led to and from the area, even though Benjamin had informed me that he no longer drove back there. As I bent down to inspect a particularly suspicious patch of ground, I saw something that made my heart race. A tiny piece of blue fabric that was no larger than a postage stamp sticking up through the dirt. I brushed away some of the loose dirt surrounding it and discovered more pieces, along with what appeared to be pieces of black plastic sheeting. My hands trembled as I dug a little deeper with a stick I found nearby, uncovering more plastic and fabric that was definitely not natural, something that resembled unsettling chunks of concrete. And as I worked, the smell got stronger until I had to take a deep breath through my mouth. At that moment, I heard footsteps behind me, and Benjamin was approaching me from across the yard, his expression unable to read in the dim light discover anything intriguing. He inquired in a tone that was casual and unaccustomed to me, but there was a hint of something that made every instinct in curiosity killed the cat, as they say, and Benjamin nodded slowly as his eyes remained focused on the tiny hole had begun excavating, just curious about the smell. I managed to mumble, rising up and wiping the dirt from my knees. He laughed when he was satisfied, but there was no warmth in it. "Why don't you go inside and clean up? I've been putting off dealing with this area for too long," but I scarcely slept that night. I was startled by the old cottage and found myself repeatedly checking the locks on our doors. Emma asked me why I appeared so exhausted the following morning, and I told her that I had been experiencing nightmares, which wasn't totally false. Over the next few days, Benjamin changed. He still kept up his courteous demeanor, but I noticed that he was observing me more intently. When he assumed I wasn't looking, he began inquiring about my daily schedule and asking me specific locations. "Just making sure you and Emma are safe out here," he would say, but his eyes conveyed a different message. When I inquired about it, he merely stated that he had had some landscaping work done, but I hadn't seen or heard any workers, and the gravel appeared to have been spread hastily, with uneven patches and gaps where the small hole I had dug by the water tank had been filled in. I began making excuses to drive into town more frequently, always bringing Emma along. On one of these excursions, I stopped at the neighborhood diner and started talking to Janet, the waitress who had been there for 30 years. She was a talkative woman with grey hair and perceptive eyes who seemed to know. She looked around anxiously and then leaned closer, saying, "You be careful out there, that place has a history." Her attitude instantly changed when I explained that I was working at the hay farm. She informed me about Sarah, a charming little girl who resided in the guest cottage about 20 years ago and helped Benjamin's wife Margaret with chores. She couldn't have been older than 19, but one day she simply disappeared. Benjamin said that she packed everything and went without saying anything, but Janet's account differed from what she had heard from people in the community. Some claimed that she was pregnant, and she murmured as she refilled my coffee cup while trembling. Others claimed that she and Benjamin were, well, Margaret had cancer and was hardly conscious most of the time. No one wanted to accuse a man of the cloth of anything wrong, so she stopped and looked out the window toward the farm. What's odd is that the girl's car was discovered abandoned at the bus terminal 2 towns over, but no one ever witnessed her boarding a bus, and her possessions including her pocketbook, which still had all of her cash, were abandoned in the cottage clothes pictures. What kind of runaway leaves everything behind? My coffee tasted bitter all of a sudden, and I could feel my appetite waning. Did anyone ever look into this? I questioned Janet, who shrugged. When I called my sister Lisa in Texas that evening and told her everything, she didn't hesitate for a second. "Pack your stuff and get out of there tonight," she said firmly. "You can stay." The sheriff at the time, Benjamin's brother-in-law, claimed there was no evidence of foul play and that the young girl had simply chosen to start over somewhere else. Leaving wasn't as easy as I had hoped. All of our possessions were in the cottage, Emma was at last content and at peace, and I didn't have nearly enough money saved for a security deposit on a new location. And what if I was mistaken? What if I was allowing small-town rumors and paranoia to keep me from the best chance we'd had in years? I chose to give it another day to see if I could find any hard proof that would either allay my fears or allay them. I should have listened. To the following morning, Lisa, Benjamin departed early to go to his doctor in the next county for a routine checkup. He had indicated on multiple occasions that Emma was having a play date at a neighbor's house, which gave me the ideal opportunity to thoroughly investigate. I went straight to the water tank with a genuine shovel. I started digging in the same spot where I'd found the fabric because I was determined to dig deep enough to discover what was actually buried there. The smell hit me like a physical wall as I got closer, stronger than ever in the morning heat. Within minutes, I hit something solid concrete, but it was broken, patched quickly with what appeared to be quickset cement. As I removed more dirt, I noticed the edges of black plastic sheeting underneath, and the stench got so bad that I had to back off and throw up in the nearby grass. With shaking hands, I used the shovel to carefully pry up one corner of the plastic, and what I saw underneath will haunt me. I ran back to the cottage, packed everything I could fit in my car in less than 20 minutes, and called Lisa while driving to pick up the fresh, decomposing remains that had been wrapped in garbage bags for the rest of my life, along with older bones and clothing underneath that, including what was clearly a human skull with long, blonde hair still attached. "Come right here, Emma," she insisted. "Don't go back to that house." However, I couldn't leave without telling the authorities about what I had discovered, so I went to the closest town's police station and informed after thoroughly excavating the area surrounding the water tank. The current sheriff, a younger man, Deputy Rodriguez, took my statement seriously and promptly sent a team to the farm. Benjamin was arrested that same afternoon. He returned from his doctor's appointment, discovered the fresh remains of a young woman who had been reported missing from a nearby town just 6 months prior, buried deeper than Sarah's remains from 20 years ago. Benjamin confessed to both murders, saying that while Sarah's death had been an accident, he had killed the second woman when she started Emma. "And I are doing well now, living with Lisa's family in Texas while I complete nursing school, but occasionally I wonder what would have happened if I had asked too many questions about the missing girl or accepting a job at a nearby farm." He was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Hadn't been intrigued by that odor, or if I hadn't had the courage to investigate, Sarah and the other victim would have received the justice they were due, which must be significant music. The first warning sign should have been the eagerness of everyone to assist us with our move. Kevin and I had recently married in February 2022, and by June we were exhausted from Chicago's city life. We had been discussing purchasing some acreage and possibly launching a small organic farm. After a period of living off the grid, we thought we had hit gold when we discovered this 20-acre property outside of Tulsa with a 2-story farmhouse that needed work but had character. The realtor, a middle-aged man called Bob, was virtually tossing the "I found it strange" that the neighbors kept showing up with casseroles and welcome presents throughout the first week of our tour in Chicago. Even though the previous owners had been motivated sellers and had left everything behind, including part of the furniture, I hardly knew anyone in my apartment complex, but in rural Kansas, it seemed like everyone wanted to say, "Hello, Mrs. Henderson from the next farm over with her famous apple pie, the Johnson family with their fresh eggs," and this older man named Frank, who said he had known that the house itself was lovely in the worn, genuine manner that city dwellers like us romanticize, and everyone had been cordial enough since he was a youngster. But there was something in their eyes when they spoke, as if they were watching our emotions and waiting for us to ask the proper questions. The kitchen featured a wood-burning stove that was still functional, original hardwood floors that creaked in certain places, windows that stuck but let in the most beautiful light, and personal belongings that the previous owners had left behind, including family photos on the mantel, clothes still hanging in the closets, and toiletries in the bathroom. Since we were starting over and could use the extra household stuff, it seemed like a blessing when they told me that they had moved abruptly for a job opportunity and couldn't take everything. However, after we had been there for about 2 weeks, I began to notice facts that didn't line up for the family. The images featured a couple our age with 2 small children, perhaps ages 6 and 8. They included vacation and school photos, as you might expect, but what really caught my attention was how modern everything appeared. The children's attire was in style, and the images had the digital feel of recent years. It was claimed that people frequently leave things behind when they're in a hurry, but something about it kept nagging at me until I lost it. If they had relocated for a job, why would they have left behind their children's school photos? Why would they have abandoned priceless family memories? When I decided to approach Mrs. Henderson about the previous owners during one of her visits, I was being casual and just said how good it was that they had left some items for us to use. Her entire face went pale, and she began to act very differently. She muttered something about how unfortunate what had happened to the Carlile family was, then abruptly shifted the topic to asking if we needed help with the garden. When I asked her what she meant by what had happened, she said she had misspoken and was trying to strangle the dish towel in her hands. Kevin and I decided to do some research that evening. They're hurriedly leaving the house as if it were on fire. We discovered the names of the previous owners on some mail that had been left behind: David and Jennifer Corral, along with their children, Emma and Noah. A quick Facebook search revealed their profiles, but the thing that really got my nerves was that their most recent posts were from exactly 1 year ago, and they had nothing to do with relocation or new employment prospects. Jennifer's last post featured a picture of the children playing in what I recognized as our backyard, along with a note about how much they cherished their forever home. What was even more disturbing was a status update 3 days prior that said they finally felt like they belonged somewhere. Kevin suggested that we drive into town to see if anyone at the local businesses remembered them and perhaps get some genuine answers about what had happened after their social media went completely silent. We tried calling the number on some of the mail, but it was disconnected. Our first stop was the hardware store, where the owner, a stern man named Dale, "God, we should let sleeping dogs lie," he remarked, shaking his head when I asked him directly about what had happened to them. He was obviously uncomfortable when we mentioned the Coral name and kept looking about as if he was afraid someone could overhear us. The same pattern was seen at the neighborhood cafe, the post office, and the grocery store. Everyone knew something, but no one was speaking. 3 days later, a piece of plain white paper with words cut out of it was pushed under our front door while we were asleep. Kevin wanted to take it to the police, but I told him to wait since we had only been in town for a month, and making enemies with the locals wouldn't help us create the life we wanted. Instead, we decided to be more polite and stop asking questions like something from a bad horror movie. Subtly about our investigation, perhaps looking through public records or old newspaper archives online, which is how we discovered the article that altered everything. It was hidden in the local newspaper website's archives and was published precisely 13 months ago. A local family had reported missing and not showing up for their scheduled initially. The article was incredibly ambiguous, stating that Jennifer had neglected to collect up the children from school and David Corral had missed a crucial business meeting. Their car was discovered in the driveway, with the keys still in the ignition, and the police showed no indications of fighting. The family had simply disappeared, leaving behind their entire lives as if they had vanished into thin air. But when we continued searching through the newspaper archives, we found that this wasn't an isolated incident every few years. The investigation, however, found no evidence of foul play. Similar incidents occurred in previous decades. The Henderson family vanished from the same home in 1987. leaving a hot meal on the table. And the Morrison clan vanished overnight in 1994, leaving their livestock in the barn without food. The same families would purchase our land, settle in, and then abruptly go. The local newspaper would always describe them as missing, never discovered, and never explained. Yet somehow, when the second note showed up the morning after we printed out all those newspaper pieces, it was more straightforward and said, "Leave now or join them." However, what truly frightened me was that the house invariably wound up back on the market within a year and typically sold for considerably below market value to the next unwary family. When Kevin discovered our dog Buster lying still by his food bowl that same afternoon, he hurried him to the emergency veterinarian in the nearby town. But it was too late. The veterinarian stated that the symptoms suggested that our dog had likely been poisoned by antifreeze, and that someone had killed him on purpose that evening in order to communicate with us. Kevin wanted to pack up and leave right away, but I was obstinate. We had invested everything we had in this place, and I wasn't going to let some small-town conspiracy drive us off our own land. Neither of us slept, and every creak in the old house and every wind whistle through the trees had us both jumping out of our skin. Frank, the elderly man who had claimed to know the area since he was a boy, was the one person I chose to confront because he might actually tell us the truth. The following morning, I found him at the local gas station and cornered him by his truck. When I brought up the newspaper articles and the pattern of disappearances, his face turned completely white, and he continued to carefully scanning my surroundings before grabbing my arm and whispering, "Come alone and don't tell anyone. Meet me at the old cemetery on Mill Road tonight at midnight." The graveyard was a tiny, about 5 miles from our home, on an overgrown plot behind an abandoned church. Frank was already there. He was smoking a cigarette and had trembling fingers when he told me the whole truth in frightened whispers. The ground our house was on had formerly been used for a horrible deed. In the 1800s, the town concealed a mass grave for cholera outbreak victims in order to avoid quarantine. However, Frank claims that the town had been keeping the secret for generations, and that local families who opposed the cover-up had been killed and dumped into the same pit. The present inhabitants weren't merely neighbors. They were descended from the original conspirators who were obligated by blood and guilt to preserve the town's darkest secret. Frank himself was involved, but he had matured, and anyone who entered that cursed place and began asking too many questions died. I hurried home to find Kevin collecting our necessities into rubbish bags. He had discovered a third note slid under the door while I was away, which had a picture of us. He asked me to take Kevin and escape before it was too late, because he was elderly and guilty and couldn't see another family disappear. The sergeant at the desk listened to our account with evident skepticism until I showed him that someone had been in our house while we were sleeping. So we packed everything we needed into our car and drove directly to the closest police station, which was in the next county. After he made some phone calls and read the newspaper articles and the threatening notes, state police got involved within an hour. It turned out that a federal investigation had been conducted in the area years prior, but it had been suddenly closed for lack of evidence. The state police took our statement and agreed to let us stay in a hotel while they conducted their investigation. 3 days later, they called to inform us that they had used ground-penetrating radar to excavate a portion of our land and discovered a mass grave with dozens of bodies, some dating back more than a century ago, while more recent DNA testing revealed that some of the remains belonged to the families who went missing, such as the Corals. The entire town leadership was detained, along with a number of well-known families who had participated in the plot for many generations. According to the town had been methodically killing anyone who dared to reveal their secret and then burying the bodies in the same cursed location where it all started. They had honed their method over the years and had lured in unwary families with below-average Frank had been telling the truth about everything, and his confession to the police helped uncover evidence that led to multiple life sentences for the conspirators. According to market real estate prices, we never returned to that house because the state views the property as a crime scene, and from what I understand, it has been transformed into a memorial for all the families who perished there. Kevin and I moved to Oregon and started over, and we have never regretted running when we did. While I try not to think about it too much, I occasionally wonder what might have happened if Frank hadn't had the guts to warn us. I'd just finished my divorce when the letter arrived, and I hadn't spoken to Aunt Lillian since I was a teenager. To be honest, I hardly recognized her voice. She wasn't the kind of person who was warm. We were fortunate to leave with our lives, unlike so many others who came before us. I didn't know how to react when the lawyer informed me that I had inherited her ancient farmhouse outside of Baraboo, Wisconsin. I was too emotionally spent to dispute it because my job was remote. I needed space, and the city was oppressive. The house was older than I had anticipated, the type of building that can still stand even when no one is moving, and it was situated at the end of a long gravel driveway surrounded by thick trees and vegetation. The paint had faded to a sickly pale yellow, and the place with stillness suddenly didn't sound so horrible. A greenhouse with glass panels that were mostly intact but dimmed by dirt and time stood just past a row of overgrown bushes in the back of the porch, which sagged as if it were holding its breath. From what I'd been told, Aunt Lillian spent most of her time there and was well known in the community. The house itself was messy, but not filthy, with numerous dry plants hanging upside down in bunches, jars of powders, and crushed leaves, labelled in tight calligraphy. There were also framed awards on the wall soil, and horticulture circles for her magical soil mixes, whatever that meant. Brilliance in Composition, 2008. Novel Botanical Methods, 2013. The greenhouse was secured, with a corroded chain and a lock, and everything that would signify nothing to anyone outside of that planet. I didn't feel like poking around, so I left the hefty padlock alone for a few days. However, that padlock began to bother me. Why lock it so firmly if you've had nothing to conceal? Therefore, I located the key in her bedroom, hidden beneath the velvet liner of a wooden jewelry box. When I returned to the greenhouse, I recalled that the necklace might have once been heavier than I had anticipated. Standing in a room when someone yelled made the air feel heavier. Even if it was silent, the chain slithered to the floor, and the padlock moaned open. It smelled like lemon rot and soil, and the heat hit me right away, and jagged, as if you were walking into a lung of potted plants that were half of one of the benches had them dead, while the others flourished in strange silence. It had a large potting table built into it, and underneath it were several wooden crates stacked, the most of which were loaded with tools. Empty spray bottles, sacks of labelled powders, and rusting shears, but the one when I took it out, the bottom seemed unusual. It wasn't dusty like the others. Observed that the floor underneath it was uneven, possibly a knot in the wood, but when I tapped it, the panel underneath the table snapped and raised a little. I used a towel to pry it up, and it revealed a shallow section that was only a foot deep, and what was inside caused my chest to constrict. Dozens of handwritten, folded pages on wax fabric, some of which were stained with the first page, began in mid-thought with what appeared to be dried dirt or something darker. No date or greeting is necessary. The ratio needs to be precise, because too much bone meal delays. I assumed it was a gardening technique because it breaks down fresh tissue more quickly. Notebook until I came upon a name that I recognized, Nicole Fennick. I expected to see her picture emblazoned on telephone poles and petrol pumps after she vanished 4 years ago. The following page shows that Nicole's skin resisted absorption since she wasn't properly moisturized. I almost toppled a tray of seedlings as I sat back quickly with a higher saline balance. I wish I could claim the pages weren't arranged. Instead, they were entries jammed together as though she had written them in a hurry. each one concentrating on a distinct person, some just by their first name, others all of their complete names, which I eventually looked up on Google, had been reported missing in Wisconsin within the previous 10 years. Her writing was technical rather than sentimental, and Eli bled too quickly, making Jocelyn's the drainage mesh was clogged with hair, and there were root diagrams and doodles. I couldn't stop shaking when I saw human limbs and systems next to one another, as though comparing the stages of disintegration. She wasn't composing poetry, but rather chronicling an actual event, so I took some of the pages were scribbled on the backs of seed catalogues, and others were laid out on the dining table under a lamp. Others had pictures of too hazy soil, Polaroids on shredded notebook paper, trays and plant beds, one with a boot protruding from beneath a mulch layer, another with a timestamp, and what appeared to my lips dried up like a partially decomposing, dirt-covered forearm resting next to a measuring tape. The same greenhouse table with the chipped edge and damaged tile corner was just barely visible in the backdrop. I hardly slept that night, since it seemed like the entire greenhouse was one big experiment the more I looked. The groan of the flooring and the tapping of branches against the walls were accentuated by every sound the home made. Windows the old refrigerator's faint hum around approximately 3 in the morning. I received a message from there is a faint dragging sound in the backyard, not loud, like something being my heart was racing when I sat up in bed after being slowly pulled across the greenhouse floor. Wanted to think it was an animal or the wind, but there was a rhythm to the sound, wasn't arbitrary. I checked when the sun rose, and when I arrived at the greenhouse, I saw that 2 pots had been moved a little bit off the bench, possibly Anne. I phoned the police, but I didn't tell them everything because I hadn't touched them. Just mentioned that I suspected something unsettling I discovered among my aunt's belongings might be related to missing people. They sent a young deputy and an older investigator, and I observed their faces as they went over the records. Tightening with each page, they inquired as to if I had altered anything else. I replied that I hadn't, and they said they would have. To take, I inquired if I should stay somewhere else, because I needed to analyze everything and might need to do a more complete investigation of the property. Although they stated that was up to me, the tone made it obvious that I should be discovered. 3 shallow graves behind the greenhouse, just beyond the tree line, one of which had pieces of bone and the other of which had decomposed. A third had nothing but exceptionally rich soil and garments with trace DNA, high nitrogen levels. I didn't want to find out more, so I drove away that same evening, 3 hours away to my sister's house, and I haven't been back since. The country I gave over the rights to the land when it was later designated a restricted site pending investigation, and I informed them that I desired nothing to do with it. I simply departed without ever returning to pack my belongings. I occasionally question whether she ever intended for me to discover it. Perhaps it was a perverse method of passing the torch, or perhaps it was just the last thing she was unable to speak aloud was. I don't know. What I do know is that the purpose of the greenhouse was to break down people and everything, not to cultivate plants. I wonder where it's from every time I see a pot of soil, especially the dark, wet sort that appears too healthy to be natural, truly originated from, and what was left over to enable its successful growth. Life was tranquil back then, perhaps too quiet. I had moved with my children, Logan, and after the divorce, I moved to a tiny farm in rural Alabama in search of a slower, more stable job, repairing tractors on the side and doing little repairs for neighbors. But the majority of the days were devoted to caring for the animals and maintaining. Although the house was ancient and creaked in the wind, the children were nourished and concentrated on their studies, had a large area of land, a decent roof, and although it wasn't much, it was ours, and it began with the goats in late October, and for a while, everything was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. 3 of them disappeared overnight, leaving no blood, broken fencing, or indications of a fight. I strengthened the gate and put solar lights since I thought there might be coyotes or perhaps a bobcat, I began keeping my shotgun closer to the door along the fence line's edge, but the next week I discovered the dead steer's eyes were gone, and its stomach strangely deflated as if something didn't sit properly, and there was no scavenger, but it was drained without a single tear in the hide. I mounted two trail cameras that I borrowed from my cousin to the fence posts that look north. Pasture the area with the poorest visibility. The field there has a small incline, and the grass grows only tall enough to conceal something hidden, although to be honest, I didn't have high expectations. Need evidence for animal control or anything to demonstrate to a neighbor that the cameras were moving in case there were trespassers. Triggered, and for the first 2 nights, I checked them every morning at dawn. All I saw were fuzzy pictures of the occasional barn owl or possum swooping through the frame and blowing grass, but on the 3rd night at 3:12 a.m. I saw exactly what I saw. At first, I was unable to identify what I was seeing because it wasn't standing. It was moving slowly and low across the pasture's border as it walked. A naked or near-naked man in the infrared spectrum appears pale and unwell, as if he hadn't his elbows protruded, as he pulled himself forward in this strange, somewhat mechanical pace, having not eaten in weeks. He never looked at the other creatures, or the glowing eyes in the dark, the camera, but he deliberately made his way to the barn, which I kept a secret from the children. Since the goat incident, Logan had already experienced night terror, and May was only 6 years old and unable to comprehend anything like this. I checked the fence line all day long to make sure there were no breaks or drag. Nothing happened that night, so I stayed up and sat in the front old rocking rocker. I observed the tree line through the window with the lights off and a black coffee thermos in hand, and I waited until nothing moved. The typical sounds, the rustle of leaves, the crickets, and the wind against the shutters made me wonder whether I was dreaming. Perhaps there was a camera error that captured something in mid-motion that appeared human, but I convinced myself that wasn't till the following morning. There were deep, adult-sized footprints in the garden made by bare feet. They led from the fence to the rear of the barn, where the lock had been, and it was clear that he was pressing low to the earth. One of the hens was smashed in two, but it wasn't killed, it was simply gone. The others were calm, not agitated, and not a single feather was disturbed. Most unnerved me, nonetheless. Nothing that came through frightened them, so I again watched the video. As I watched him crawl, I observed something unusual. His neck seemed to flex strangely, and his limbs didn't quite bend correctly. When he changed course, he twisted too much. This wasn't just a tense drifter. I installed 6 additional cameras because there was something wrong with this man, assuming he was a man at all. This time, moved the floodlights and secured the barn door with a strong chain to keep the children asleep in my room. Around midnight, just in case, I grabbed the shotgun and went outside onto the porch. There was no wind, no insects, and the night was still too quiet. It was like this. I went around the perimeter twice on the 3rd day, and everything was holding its breath. I heard a gentle, repetitive thud just beyond the corn rows, perhaps 50 yards away. I turned up the light, but I didn't see any footsteps or elbows hitting the ground. Seconds before I went to sleep, the corn rows were swaying gently like if someone had gone through them, and not even with these children snuggled up on blankets on the floor next to me. I couldn't stop thinking about how he moved as if he had lived his entire life. When the sun eventually came out, I was crawling as if it were impossible to stand up. Hurried outside to check the cameras, as the batteries had run out on 4 of them. Only 2 clips remained, and the clearest one showed him once more, this time up close. He was still crawling and without talking, but he stopped and raised his head toward his face was hollow, and the camera was practically through it rather than straight at it. Eyes too wide open as if they didn't, cheekbones sharp. As broken glass, I didn't view the video again, because he was blinking with his lips half open. I went into town that same afternoon and purchased floodlights powerful enough to illuminate a baseball field, which I then connected to motion sensors and positioned them throughout the property, including the tree line and the barn porch. I also acquired a pair of, but I didn't want to explain, so I changed all the latches on the sheds, the barn, and the chicken coop. Logan felt the tension and continued asking why I was locking the car during the day, but it seemed excessive to the kids. I warned him that we might have a trespasser when he brought the shotgun inside the house rather than leaving it in the truck. He didn't believe me, but that was it. He stopped asking, and the following few nights were quiet. I began to wonder whether I had scared it away. Whatever the case, the cameras captured nothing new. The animals remained where they were. There were no noises or footsteps, and the air felt lighter. I even let the children return to their own beds. But on the sixth night, as I was beginning to nod off, all of the lights on the property went out. Triggered, and as the house suddenly came to life, I leapt from my bed and seized under all that artificial light. The fields were gleaming, and in the distant corner, the gun ran barefoot out onto the porch. I observed him crawling away from the ditch, right where the meadow drops down. The barn this time in the direction of the house. He was quicker now, jerking his knees and elbows like a puppet pulled on strings. I fired a warning shot in the air as he continued to shoot forward in short bursts, digging into the ground. He didn't stop, so I aimed lower and fired once again, closer this time, and he paused when dirt exploded close to his side. Cole remained motionless, lying with his head angled sharply and partially in shade. I couldn't see his eyes that far away, but I could feel them there as he watched me. He abruptly reversed, but he didn't turn around. He just crawled in the same spot. I waited there with my revolver in hand, while he disappeared behind the slope, backwards, still staring at me the entire time, until the lights gradually went out one by one. I contacted the sheriff, and when he arrived the following morning, he looked around and he questioned whether it might have been a prank, someone playing a practical joke on me, but I didn't see any prints or evidence of a break-in. Argument simply handed him the video, which he viewed quietly before shutting down the laptop and instructing me to keep the children inside. After that night, everything has been quiet once more, with no lights. Footage. I've changed the batteries and continue to check the cameras every morning, religiously, but I've never seen him again, and I'm not sure what it was. Desired, but I no longer go into the fields after dark, not even with a flashlight or a rifle.